She was cooking alone in the kitchen, until the cowboy crossed by and stopped when he heard her humming. Montana Territory, late autumn, 1886. The highlands of Barrow Creek lay blanketed in dry gold and the dying reds of early frost. Wind combed through the grass like invisible fingers, and chimney smoke twisted above rooftops like ghosts reluctant to leave. This was land where the rich wore clean boots and the poor earned cracked hands, where woodpiles meant survival, and a warm stove was more sacred than any chapel. The Barrow Creek Ranch stretched over hundreds of acres, its fields rolling to the base of stone-gray cliffs. Horses grazed near the fence lines. Men shouted orders, saddles creaked, and somewhere a hammer rang out against a wagon wheel. But behind the main house, in a smaller, sun-faded structure that served as the ranch's secondary kitchen, a different sound stirred the air. Evelyn Ward, 25, stood over a wood stove, her sleeves rolled and her fingers dusted in flour. She was the youngest daughter of a poor farm family, born to dirt and hard winters. School had ended at 12. Dreams had ended soon after. But she'd learned to cook, and to cook well. And to sing, when no one was listening. She hummed softly as she kneaded dough for biscuits. Nothing fancy, just a melody passed down from her mother. An old folk tune about a widow waiting for spring. Her voice was light and breathy, barely above the whisper of the rising wind. The scent of browning butter mingled with the hymn. The oven hissed, and she moved with quiet grace, brushing egg wash, turning pans, never missing a note. Outside, hooves slowed against gravel. Graham Thatcher, heir to the Thatcher estate, one of the wealthiest landowners in the Montana Territory, had ridden out from the north side fence line. His coat was dark wool, his gloves unbuttoned. He was heading toward the main house when something stopped him. A sound. Not just a voice, but a voice wrapped in longing. He slowed his horse. Listened. The voice drifted from the half-open window of the back kitchen. It was not polished, not trained, but it was pure, like creek water trickling over stone, soaked in a sadness too old for someone so young. Graham dismounted quietly. He stepped close to the window but did not look in. The last few rays of sun caught in his hair as he stood still, hands in his pockets. Inside, Evelyn sang the final line of the verse. "And if the sun forgets to rise, I'll find the light in you." Then silence. Only the crackle of the fire and the creak of the cooling stove. Evelyn turned, startled by a strange stillness outside. Through the corner of the window, she thought she saw a shadow move, but by the time she opened the door, the yard was empty. Just the breeze, just the sky fading orange. She was about to close the door when her eye caught something on the wooden step. A small, folded scrap of fine parchment. She bent, picked it up with floured fingers, and unfolded it carefully. 7 words, written in neat, deliberate script. I didn't know kitchens could sing. No name, no signature. Only a single stray hoofprint in the dirt, already softening under the wind. Evelyn tucked the parchment into the back of her recipe ledger, the one with flour-dusted pages and the corner that curled like an old leaf. She didn't tell anyone. Who would she tell? The other kitchen girls would only scoff, and the ranch hands didn't much care what she sang while baking biscuits. But something about the note stayed with her. The ink, the weight of those 7 words, the way they saw more than just her hands or her food. They saw something inside the kitchen, inside her. So she kept singing, quietly, softly, only when she was alone, when the morning frost still clung to the windows, or in the hush of twilight as the last supper dish dried on the rack. Always the same kind of songs, old, worn things passed down from her mother, half lullaby, half longing. She started noticing small things, like how the wind always shifted through the kitchen window around the same time in the late afternoon. How sometimes the horses grew quiet near the stable wall, as if even they paused to listen. How the same hoofprint kept appearing near the back steps. It was foolish, she told herself, romantic nonsense, but still her voice never trembled when she sang anymore. It waited, almost as if expecting to be heard. Then came the day she saw him. Late afternoon, 2 loaves cooling on the sill, hands plunged into soapy water. She was scrubbing the pan from the roast, sleeves wet to the elbow, humming the verse of a tune called Lowland Rose, something her mother used to sing when the baby cried. She turned to shake water from her hands and froze. Just outside the window, no more than 10 feet away, a figure stood motionless by the fence post. Hat low, shoulders broad. His coat was dusted with trail dust, and his boots were planted firm in the earth. She couldn't see his face clearly through the glass, but she knew. She didn't stop what she was doing, just turned back to the sink, heart hammering, and softly, almost without meaning to, she began to hum again. 1 verse. 2. When she stepped out to dump the dishwater, the yard was empty once more. But on the top step lay a single daisy. A mountain daisy, pale yellow, delicate, the kind that never grew near the ranch. Someone had ridden into the hills for that. She picked it up gently, feeling its soft weight in her fingers. It wasn't a letter, but it spoke just the same. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the way he had stood there, still as the fence post, as if her song had stitched him in place. 2 days later, as she was pulling cornbread from the oven, she heard a rustle behind the woodshed. Not loud, just the faint sound of a boot against gravel. She didn't turn. She only said, soft as steam, "You don't have to leave something behind every time." A pause. Then a voice, not loud, not sharp, but deep and real and close. "I only do it when the quiet feels better than talking." Evelyn spun, hand still clutching the towel. There he was. Graham Thatcher, in the flesh. Dust in his hair, a small tear at the hem of his coat, his eyes calm, unreadable. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd, just enough to be real. "You don't just cook," he said gently. "You keep something alive in here." Then, as if he hadn't just unraveled a thread in her chest, he tipped his hat and turned, walking back into the wind. Autumn deepened, curling the leaves into red fists and sending the winds through the rafters like old spirits. With each passing day, Evelyn noticed a rhythm forming, not in the food, but in the silences that surrounded her, a pattern that wore no words and asked for none. Graham Thatcher had started appearing more often. Never predictably, never formally, but she'd turn and find a fresh stack of firewood by the kitchen door, still damp at the edges from the creek bed, or the broken hinge on the pantry cabinet would be fixed without anyone saying when. One afternoon she came out back to find the small bench, warped by rain for months, sanded smooth and re-nailed, waiting quietly beneath the window, where she often sat during break. He never said, "I did this," but she knew. Once, she caught him in the act, his sleeves rolled as he adjusted shingles on the roof above the kitchen porch. He'd glanced down when she opened the back door, nodded once, and kept hammering. No smile, no explanation. That was the way of it. No promises, no questions, just small, quiet offerings. And Evelyn, who had never been offered much in her life, found herself unsure how to carry this kind of attention. It was not the kind of courtship others dreamed of. There were no flowers in vases or dances under moonlight, only a man who seemed to listen with his hands instead of his mouth. But the ranch was not blind, and neither were its people. It started with whispers. "She's got the rich man bringing her wood like she's royalty. I guess all it takes is some humming and biscuits. And worse, he'll get bored soon, then she'll be back to scrubbing alone." The kitchen staff began casting glances when Graham passed by. One girl, Molly, laughed outright when she saw him place a jar of honey on the pantry shelf and leave without a word. "Imagine that," she sneered. "Sugar for the cook, how poetic." Evelyn said nothing, but her ears burned, and her heart started retreating behind the walls she thought she'd torn down. She told herself to stop humming, to focus on the food, on her work, to forget the way he lingered a second longer in the doorway, the way he left the kind of silence behind that made the air feel full. By the second week of October, she avoided looking toward the stables where his horse was often tied. She no longer opened the back door during breaks, and she stopped singing. The kitchen felt colder without the music, and lonelier. That was why, on the morning the rains came, cold and biting, she dragged herself from bed with a heavy heart. Her boots were soaked from the night before, left in the corner of the entry where she'd forgotten them in her distracted haze. She pulled on her wool socks and braced herself for the soggy chill of wet leather. But when she stepped into the kitchen, something stopped her. There, by the hearth, sat her boots. Not where she left them. They had been dried, the mud scrubbed clean, stuffed gently with cloth to hold their shape, relaced with care, and placed neatly on a folded flour sack, directly beside the fire. Still warm. Still holding the scent of smoke and pine. She stared at them for a long moment, lips parting in disbelief. There was no note. No shadow in the doorway. Just the weight of a gesture done not for thanks, not for recognition, but because someone noticed and cared. She crossed the room slowly, knelt beside the boots, and touched the leather. Dry, soft, thoughtful. Her chest tightened in a way she hadn't expected. This wasn't courtship. This wasn't flirtation. This was something older. Something steadier. She slipped into the boots, now dry and comfortable, and stood slowly. The fire crackled behind her, and for the first time in days, she felt warm, clear to the bone. She turned toward the window, uncertain of what she was hoping to see. But the yard was empty. And yet, she smiled. Because whoever had been there had left something more than just dry boots. They had left a question, without asking it. And in her quiet, stubborn heart, she began to find the beginning of an answer. The next Saturday morning broke with a pale sun and a hush in the wind, the kind of quiet that settled into the corners of Barrow Creek, like dust that didn't want to be swept. The work bell hadn't rung yet when Evelyn stepped outside, arms folded against the chill. Graham stood by the hitching post near the back kitchen, his horse already saddled, one hand resting gently on the reins. His coat was heavier than usual, collar turned up, and his hat shaded his eyes, but he was watching her. "Ride with me," he said, not a question. She hesitated, looked back toward the open kitchen door. The pots hadn't even started boiling yet. "Just for an hour," he added, voice quiet. "You'll be back before they miss you." She nodded once, slow, and ducked inside to grab her shawl. They rode in silence for a time, side by side, not speaking. The trail behind the barn climbed gently, then curved hard through brush and loose rock. She realized quickly that this wasn't a path made for show. This was a path someone rode often, alone. When they reached the crest, Graham dismounted and helped her down. The wind picked up, tugging at her hair and shawl, but she barely noticed. Before them stretched the whole valley. The ranch looked smaller from here, the fences no longer rigid lines but soft curves bending with the land. Barns like toy blocks, the kitchen no more than a flicker of smoke. Mountains framed the scene in the distance, snow still clinging to their tops. Evelyn inhaled deeply. "It's quiet up here." Graham crouched beside a stone, brushing off dried moss. "I come here when I need to forget the numbers," he said. "Numbers?" He glanced over. Head count, feed weight, fencing yards, profit margins, all the things that keep this place running and keep a man from breathing. She said nothing, only watched him. He sat on the rock, gesturing for her to do the same. She did, folding her shawl tighter. "Do you ever feel like life handed you a name, and not a choice?" he asked suddenly. Evelyn blinked at the question. Then she nodded. "Every day since I was 12. Same." She looked over, surprised. "You?" she asked softly. He gave a dry chuckle. "I was born with land in my name and expectations in my cradle. They said I'd marry someone from the East, take over the estate, raise heirs and cattle, and God knows what else. And I've done most of it. Except," he paused, "except the parts that felt like mine." They sat in silence, the wind moving around them like a third presence. Finally, he spoke again. "I live in a big house, Evelyn, Bigger than it should be, 3 fireplaces, 4 bedrooms, and it's been silent for years. He turned to her. No one sings in it. Evelyn looked away, heart stung by the honesty. Then, slowly, Graham reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He handed it to her, without a word. She took it carefully, flipping through the pages. Blank. All of them. I bought it years ago, he said. Told myself I'd write something real in it someday, but I never did. He looked at her. If you wrote down what you sing, the world wouldn't think of you as just the quiet girl who cooks. They'd know you have something to say. Her throat tightened. She held the notebook close, the leather warm from his coat. Why me? She asked. His eyes didn't waver. Because I've lived with quiet long enough to know when it finally says something worth listening to. And for the first time since she'd come to Barrow Creek, Evelyn didn't feel small in the silence. She felt, heard. The summer crept into Barrow Creek like honey poured slow from a tin. Long days, dry grass, and the distant hum of crickets. The valley warmed, softened. But inside the town, something colder began to stir. It started as whispers. A ranch hand from Thatcher Estate went into town for seed and came back chuckling. They say the cook's after the landowner, he told the others over coffee. Said she's singing her way into the main house. By week's end, it was no longer just whispers. It was certainty. Everyone from the saloon girls to the seamstress seemed to have a version. She lured him in with that sad little voice. A clever girl, used a song instead of rouge. They say he's building her a place to live on the hill. The worst part? None of it was true. But Evelyn felt the weight of every word. Molly, one of the other kitchen girls, passed her a bowl too hard during lunch prep and muttered under her breath, "Maybe if I hummed more, I wouldn't be peeling potatoes." She said nothing, just kept working, kept her eyes down. But inside, something began to splinter. She started sleeping less, humming less, and retreating more into herself. Even Graham's quiet visits felt like too much attention. What had once felt like something sacred between them now felt exposed, twisted into gossip for people to chew and spit. When the Barrow Creek Summer Jubilee came, an annual festival held in the town square with music, booths, and dancing, Evelyn had no plans to attend, but Mrs. Layton, the ranch cook, insisted she deliver 3 pies and a tray of peach tarts to the festival table. So Evelyn went. She wore her plainest dress, hair tied back, and kept to the side, hoping to drop off the dishes and slip away unnoticed. But life rarely let the quiet ones leave easily. As she crossed the square toward the food table, balancing the tray, she heard her name. Evelyn Ward. She looked up. A young woman in a silk dress and lace gloves stood at the edge of the crowd. She was striking, glossed hair, perfectly painted lips, and the unmistakable air of someone raised with every comfort. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said gently. "Do I know you?" "No," the woman replied with a smirk, "but I've heard of you. You're the singing girl from the kitchen." The crowd quieted. A few people turned, sensing something was coming. The woman continued, "They say you've caught Graham Thatcher's attention." Evelyn's cheeks flamed. She looked around, praying for a way out. But the woman stepped closer. "I suppose a cook with a sweet song is more charming than a lady with a proper title." Her voice dripped with mockery. "Still, let's not confuse things. A kitchen girl might hum, but she doesn't marry a landowner." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Evelyn froze. The tray in her hands trembled. She didn't cry. Not then. She turned, walked away from the food table, left the tarts behind, and kept walking until she was out of the square and onto the dirt road leading back to the ranch. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The shame clung to her skin like dust. By the time she reached the kitchen door, her decision was made. She would leave. She would pack what little she owned, write a note, and disappear before sunrise. But she didn't get the chance. Because just as she was turning the handle, a horse galloped into town. The sound of hooves rang out, hard and fast, silencing the chatter in the square. Graham Thatcher rode straight into the crowd, dismounted, and strode through the stunned onlookers with fire in his eyes. He didn't look left, didn't look right. He stopped in the center of the square, facing the very woman who'd made Evelyn's heart crack open just moments ago. "I heard what you said," he began. People held their breath. "I heard you mock a woman who's done nothing but work, feed others, and carry herself with dignity." He turned slowly, voice rising just enough. "And I've watched her do it day after day, without expectation, without complaint, while most of you stand around and let gossip do your thinking." Then his gaze swept the crowd, calm, sharp, unwavering. "I'd rather marry the woman who sings alone and feeds others than anyone who only knows how to impress a crowd." Silence. Then, somewhere near the pie booth, a fork clattered to the ground. Graham didn't wait for applause. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode toward the ranch without another word. And back in the kitchen, Evelyn stood frozen, his words echoing in her chest. Her hand was still on the door. But something in her heart had already opened. The wind came down from the mountains like a freight train that night, sharp, relentless, loud enough to rattle window panes and whisper through every crack in the wood. It was the first hard wind of autumn, and it caught the valley off guard. In the back kitchen of Barrow Creek, Evelyn stayed late, kneading dough and setting out pans for the morning's baking. The others had gone home. She liked this time of night, when the stove crackled low and the only sound was the soft thump of her hands pressing rhythm into dough. But the wind made things strange. The chimney whined with pressure, and the draft pushed smoke back down into the room. At first, Evelyn barely noticed, then the air thickened, her throat burned. She turned to open the small window above the sink, but the gust slammed it shut with a bang that jarred her. Startled, she backed into the stove. A piece of burning coal tumbled from the open grate and rolled under a rag on the floor. She reached for it, but by the time she snatched up the cloth, a slow ribbon of smoke had already begun to rise. Her lungs tightened. She coughed, then again, trying to wave the smoke away. But the draft only pushed more into the room. Her eyes watered, the walls blurred. She stumbled toward the door, but the latch caught. Her fingers fumbled. The wind howled outside, pushing against her from the other side. She sank to her knees, choking, vision swimming. And then everything went black. Graham had been walking the gravel path between the barn and the main house when he heard it, a crash of metal, then silence. He turned instantly, scanning the shadows. The back kitchen, smoke coiled against the pale light of the moon. He ran. No hesitation. The door resisted at first, as if the air inside was clinging to its own disaster. He threw his shoulder into it once, twice, and it gave. Smoke billowed out like a beast unleashed. "Evelyn!" he shouted, diving low. She was there, crumpled near the stove, her skirts soiled with soot, her apron singed. He pulled off his coat, wrapped it around her, and lifted her into his arms. The embers licked at his sleeves. One side of the coat caught fire. He slapped it out with his palm, teeth clenched, and didn't stop moving. Out the door, into the wind. He carried her straight to the main house, ignoring the startled glances from the housemaid in the hallway. He laid her gently on the long bench beside the hearth, grabbed a blanket from the settee, and covered her. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. He brought a cold cloth from the basin and pressed it to her brow, then another, then again. He didn't sit. He knelt, beside her, beside the fire, beside everything he hadn't known he needed until now. And he stayed. All night. The light of early dawn crept in through the parlor windows when she stirred. Her lips parted, a soft gasp escaping as her eyes fluttered open. He was still there. Head bowed, fingers wrapped around hers. She blinked, tried to speak. He lifted his gaze to hers, and the lines around his eyes deepened, not from age, but from the weight of everything he hadn't said. "If the kitchen is your song," he said quietly, voice rough from smoke and worry, "then let me be the walls that keep it safe." She didn't answer with words, only tightened her hand around his. The story of the fire spread faster than any wind that had come down from the mountains. Before the sun was fully overhead the next day, it had passed from bunkhouse to stable, from post office to saloon. Evelyn Ward, the quiet kitchen girl, had nearly perished in the blaze, and Graham Thatcher had carried her out like she was made of light and breath, not flour and ash. They said he burst through the smoke, coughing and shouting her name, said he cradled her like something breakable and cursed at God under his breath when she didn't wake right away. Said he stayed by her cot all night, his coat draped over her, a bucket of water at his side even after the danger had passed. No one said it aloud, but something shifted. The ranch hands, those who once joked about her humming, now met her with nods held longer, with respect that didn't need words. The stable boy, barely 14, started bringing in extra kindling without being asked. Molly, who once rolled her eyes behind Evelyn's back, now cleaned the pans without complaint. Even Mrs. Turnley, the forewoman's sharp-tongued wife who hadn't smiled since '82, left a jar of strawberry preserves on the pantry shelf with a folded note. For the strong heart behind the oven. They no longer looked at Evelyn as the quiet girl who made biscuits and kept to herself. Now they looked at her as the woman the boss had risked burning alive to save. And they began to understand why. Graham, for his part, said very little. He returned to his routines, the early rides, the ledgers, the steady presence at dusk. But 3 days after the fire, carpenters arrived. No one had asked them to. They started with the roof, shingled new and taller. Then the walls came down. A new stone hearth rose from the floor. Wide windows opened to the east, catching the morning Sunday. Wooden beams were sanded smooth, shelves rebuilt by hand. What had once been the old back kitchen became something else entirely, something with heart. When Evelyn finally asked what was happening, Graham handed her a folded sketch, yellowed at the edges from time. "It's yours," he said simply. Across the top, in elegant script, were the words, "The Quiet Stove. A place for travelers, ranchers, and the songs that feed them." He never explained the name. He didn't have to. The hand-carved sign went up just above the new entryway. It read, "Where her songs kept us fed." The day it opened, people came. Ranch hands in clean shirts, townsfolk who once scoffed, passing riders who followed the scent of bread baking on the breeze. They came for the stew, the molasses pie, the soft cornbread Evelyn had always made, but now it was served without apology. Evelyn chose the menu each morning. She brewed coffee in copper pots, kept a vase of daisies by the window. She still sang, but not like before. Not quietly. Not timidly. Her voice rose strong now, filling the rafters like firelight. She was never alone in the kitchen again. Each morning, before sunrise, Graham was already there, chopping wood, stoking the stove, wiping down tables. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to. His hands worked beside hers like they'd always known the rhythm. Once, a ranch hand wandered in early, hat in hand, and found them moving through the kitchen in quiet tandem, passing bowls, brushing shoulders, two people who no longer lived in separate silences. He smiled and said, "Didn't know a kitchen could feel like church." Graham didn't look up from his dish towel. "She's the one that made it holy," he said. And Evelyn, standing at the stove, humming as she stirred the morning's first pot, simply smiled and sang. 1 year later, the Quiet Stove had become more than a place to eat. It was a place people came to feel. Travelers left coins and stayed for stories. Ranch hands brought their wives on Sunday mornings for cornbread and quiet. There were no loud announcements, no stage, no spotlight, just the scent of stew, the warmth of wood, and sometimes, softly, Evelyn's voice carrying from behind the stove. One spring morning, while sorting through supplies, she found a letter tucked beneath a sack of flour. The handwriting was small, careful, a girl's. "Dear Miss Evelyn, my name is Anna. I live in a little town downriver. I heard someone talk about your kitchen and how you sing when you cook. I like to sing too, but people laugh. They say it doesn't matter, that no one wants to hear it. I feel silly when I open my mouth sometimes, But when I heard about you, I guess I just wanted to ask, does it ever matter? Really? Evelyn read the letter twice. Then once more. That night, she sat in the quiet corner of the kitchen, lit a lamp, and wrote back. Dear Anna, I used to sing only when I was alone too, not because I was shy, but because I didn't think anyone cared to hear. I thought my voice was like a bird in a storm, too small to make a difference. I was wrong. Somewhere along the way, someone stopped and listened. That was enough to remind me that a song doesn't need applause to matter. It only needs honesty and a heart to come from. So sing, Anna. Not for claps, not for the ones who mock you. Sing because your voice belongs in the world, even if only the wind hears it. One day, someone might stop for you too. Someone who's been walking through silence for so long, they forgot what warmth sounds like. Don't wait for someone to give your song meaning. Let it mean something to you first, and if you're lucky, someone worthy will listen. And if no one else does, write me again. I'll be listening. With love, Evelyn Ward. The Quiet Stove, Barrow Creek. She folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and added a small daisy to the envelope. The next morning, she watched it leave with the postman, carried by horse and dust and the hush of open skies. She didn't know where Anna's road would lead. But she hoped it would start with a song. If Evelyn's story warmed something quiet in you, if you've ever felt small, unseen, or unsure whether your voice mattered, remember this. Sometimes, it only takes one person to stop and listen. Sometimes, the smallest songs feed the deepest hearts. If The Quiet Stove touched your soul, hit that hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where we tell true-hearted tales from the untamed American frontier. New stories every week, of love that lingers, courage that whispers, and voices that rise even in silence. Join us. Let your heart ride with ours, through dust, danger, and devotion.